So what I'm going to do is I'll try to keep it short as I promised. How does this work? Okay, thanks. Okay, so my presentation structure, mainly because I'm a geographer, I'll be talking a lot through maps. That will be my main form of communication. My structure of my presentation, I'll start with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is brought out every 3 or 4 years on the main status of climate change. What are the main trends in climate change? From there, I'll move on to, because the topic of my presentation is on Global South, so I'll spend a little bit of time, try to be quick on why the Global South. And from there, I will, after I've introduced the spatial patterns of climate change, I'll move into spatial patterns of gender inequalities and gaps. And finally, try to relate gender inequalities and gaps to climate vulnerability and exposure indices. And finally, end with future studies. All right, so quickly, this is the latest report from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Many of you may have heard. This just shows the spatial patterns of trends in temperatures, and I'll show you some decadal spatial patterns of trends in temperature. As you can see that there is substantial variations, spatial variations in temperature trends. Some areas, temperatures are increasing at a much higher rate compared to other areas. But overall, we can say that the entire globe has experienced higher temperatures, decadal and interannual variability. The global linear trends, there's more or less general consensus about a 0.85 degrees Celsius temperature change over the time period 1880 to 2012. However, as I mentioned, there is a lot of variation. The trends have changed temporally as well as spatially. And for the most recent decade, 2003 to 2012, the rate of increase in temperature was 0.78 degrees Celsius. And I was just reading the latest report on the state of climate change on the Earth's surface just came out, and 2014 has now been declared as the hottest year on record. So we started with 1997 was the hottest year, then became 98, then 2005, and now 2014 has been the hottest year. I don't know what is happening with 2015 yet. This is the decadal level changes, spatial patterns and trends in temperature. So one of the interesting things to notice is this is from 1911 to 1940, then 1951 to 80, 81 to 2012. These patterns are generated from this particular data set, which is the merged land-ocean surface temperature data set. And as you can see, that in the in-between period, 1951 to 1980, this is when we did experience a little bit of cooling, which generated a lot of articles during that time in the 70s, especially about global cooling. However, the latest period, 1981 to 2012, as you can see, most areas, most land surface at least, has experienced substantial warming, temperature increase. All right, so some other findings about from the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change includes significant decrease in the number of cold days and nights. I know from Canada you might not believe that, but that has happened in the rest of the world, or in Scandinavia for that matter. Higher frequency of heat waves, and this has been experienced in parts of Europe, Asia, Australia. A lot of people are going to Germany thinking it's going to be cool, and then the hotels do not have air conditioning. My sister was there recently, so I know. So this is becoming a more major issue. And on the right side, just to show you again some of the general trends, this is the global average temperature. This is the global temperature trends. As you can see, there's been a steep increase in global average temperatures. Here is a global average sea level again. Sea level is rising. I'm from Miami. We very well know what is sea level rise. Every rain event, there's flooding, more flooding occurring every year. And this is the only thing which is showing a decline is the northern hemispheric snow cover. Actually, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, every year they bet on that the North Pole is going to become completely ice-free. It's that bad, the amount of snow cover, decrease in snow cover. So therefore, that is, those are the main findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What is more important is that there is no study, there's no chapter, there's no mention about the impacts, any impacts in terms of gender related. What is, are the impacts gender neutral? Some of the impacts, this is just a cartoon summarizing most of you know about climate change, but this is just a cartoon summarizing some of the major impacts of climate change in terms of talk about heat stroke, frostbite, or Bangladesh sea level rise. These are just some of the, and there are many other, this is just some of the impacts of climate change or projected impacts of climate change or already occurring impacts of climate change. So why the Global South? So my research is focused on the Global South. Being a geographer, as I mentioned, I'm very spatial. So I look at trends spatially, patterns spatially. So as you can see that the trends have not been uniform all across the globe, absolutely. Some parts of the Earth's surface has shown steeper increases. Of course, Northern Europe, you see North America, steeper increases. But what is more important is that, firstly, my argument is that there is substantial spatial variations in trends in climate change, climate variables. Secondly, this is a map showing the distribution of weather stations around the Earth's surface. And what we mean by the Global South, I'm mainly looking at south of Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia, most of Asia. And as you may see that the distribution stations is very sparse in the Global South. So we do not have much representation, or we do not really have much evidence or information about the long-term trends in climate change in this part of the world. So climate change impacts, and other than that, if I've still not convinced you, other parts why climate change, it is important to study the Global South is, of course, the long-term trends of climate change are particularly significant for vulnerable populations in the Global South. And there is much uncertainty about the regional dimensions. What are the regional variations of climate change, again, in the Global South, because it's substantial variation. There is not one, we cannot just apply one reasoning, one kind of causative forces in explaining the patterns. We also, climate change is also aggravated by widespread poverty and lack of adequate public infrastructure in most of the Global South. In addition, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there are several studies which have shown that there are increases in the number of heavy precipitation events recorded in many regions of the world. I was just talking to a postdoctoral researcher yesterday who was born and brought up in Seoul. She must be in her 20s. And even in that short lifespan of 20 years, she could tell me that Seoul has been experiencing change in climate weather conditions. She said that temperatures, summers have become a lot warmer. She also mentioned, I was actually very happy to hear, because this is one of my areas of research, is extreme rainfall. And she mentioned that when it rains in Seoul nowadays, it's very heavy rainfall within a very short period of time, which leads to flooding. Lots of flooding problems. And that's exactly part of climate change. A lot of times people counter me by saying, but we have very cold winters. What about the cold nor'easters we had in the United States? And I say, climate change is just not only warmer temperatures. Climate change is variable climate conditions or abnormal climate. What you expect is not happening. So talking about heavy precipitation events, extreme weather, these are just two news items I just found doing a basic research. This is severe weather events, flooding, which occurred in South America, parts of South America this year. And then, of course, we can't ignore Southeast Asia and Bangladesh. There were also a lot of flooding. There was flooding in parts of India, parts of Pakistan, flooding which is happening almost every year. They go from droughts to floods, very extreme weather conditions. All right, so therefore a better understanding of the impacts of global environmental change will require an integrated international effort to collect, synthesize, analyze the pertinent data and effective action. This is from the Stern report in 2007, the report which has been widely cited in many published literature. And then, of course, more specifically, we need to look at it spatially. We need to look at it at different spatial scales, because, as I mentioned again, the conditions, the trends are different in different parts of the world. So therefore, we need to look at it at different spatial scales. So therefore, and then finally, I would just like to show some of the. This is what this is the map of the global south. That's what I considered the global south. Took into consideration. This just shows the population density. As many of you know, the two countries with the highest population are located in the global south. This just shows the distribution of population density, and of course, here's where you have the highest population density. So that's important to take into consideration. And this is the gross domestic per capita income distribution in the global south. So therefore, let's move on to some of the regional, and this is also the regional level changes in the Human Development Index. So what I did was, most of my research till now has been on climate change, but I decided to look at some of these socioeconomic indices. And this just shows the change in Human Development Index. Many of you may be familiar with the Human Development Index, which is released by the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. They come up with the HDR, Human Development Report. And this just shows, at the bottom you can see the legend for the different regions of the world and the change in HDI over from 1980 to 2013. And of course, most regions showed a positive direction. That is, there was a improvement in the overall Human Development Index. However, our climate change, am I done? Gender neutral? No, they are not. So I'll just move on to my, I'll show my maps rather. Hopefully, these are all in my slides. You can see that there are substantial reasons why we need to take into consideration gender, that is, climate change impacts are not gender neutral. We need to look at it, what is the impact on women versus men, especially in the global south where the conditions are very different. So what I did was I took into consideration several indices because there's already a big disconnect between climate change science and social science impacts. So my purpose is what I'm hoping to do through this research is to connect the two. And what I did was I looked at the spatial distribution of Gender Development Index. So I took some gender indices. So this is the first one, the Gender Development Index, developed by the UNDP again, part of the HDR. And I'm going to show you a series of maps. I'm not going to spend too much time as I don't have much time here. Basically, just to orient you, the darker colors are higher ranks, which means higher gender gap, or there is gender disparity is higher where you have darker colors. Again, as you can see, that some of the biggest economies do not have any data for them. That's not a good sign. So here's the Gender Development Index. So I took a bunch of indices to see if I could find some general overall patterns which I can use to identify, go further deeper into, looking into what's going on there. This is Gender Inequality Index. This is also from the UNDP. And again, here also higher ranks are showing higher levels of gender disparity and gap. And so as you can see, if you look at both of these maps, you will start noticing parts of the sub-Saharan Africa. This is the region, and South Asia and Southeast Asia, this is the region where you will be finding the darker colors. So I'm sorry, kind of try to keep your eyes trained on the colors where the darker colors are showing up. This is the Global Gender Gap Index developed by the World Economic Forum. This is the ratio between male and female, so they take into consideration different variables, and then they try to come up with the Global Gender Gap Index. Again, as you can see, a lot of data gaps are there. But if you see the previous maps also, you will again notice that it's the part of the central part, which I call the core of the global south. That's where we find the highest gender gap. That is, the darker colors again and again show up in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. I then looked at different, I broke them up into different indices. One of the main indices about gender gap includes education. That is, there I found two indices, which is expected years of schooling and mean years of schooling. And here again, lighter colors now mean as you can guess, expected years of schooling, less years of schooling are light colors, and then more years of schooling are the darker colors. So now you see the colors are reversed. So the same regions which were showing high gender gap are showing low years of schooling. That is, the colors of schooling are decreasing. So for women have less expected years of schooling as well as mean years of schooling. Again, as you can see here, in the case of expected years of schooling, of course, South Asia showed darker color, but then again, South Asia starts showing up again in the less years of schooling. And similar patterns, I'm going to wrap it up quickly. Then this is the empowerment. Empowerment means mainly in terms of participation in the labor force, or if there is how many women occupy parliamentary seats. And again, what we see is, which I found was interesting, was what I call the core, that is the tropics. The central part of the global south is where you find the maximum gender disparity, that is, women are most disadvantaged. I tried to do some research on what could be the possible reasons. There are two kinds of, again, as I said, the spatial variations are important. There are two kinds of factors which are in play. In South Asia, Southeast Asia, this is the part of the world where a lot of cultural factors dominate. These are very patriarchal societies. So most of the times when it comes to education, most of the resources, most of the money is spent on educating the boy child. I can talk about at length about some of the articles which have shown that even height of boys versus girls, height of boys are taller than girls' heights. Education, that is, a lot of times parents will spend more money on education of the children. It's more cultural in the South Asia, Southeast Asia, whereas in Central Africa, my hypothesis is that it's more related with scarcity of resources. Recently, proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, there was an article talking about the Syrian conflict related to droughts. Then also, if we talk about the Darfur conflict, the Sudanese conflict, all of those have been some ways related to climate change, triggered by droughts, triggered by shortage of water. So what I would like to say is that even though these are the two parts, the Central Africa and South Asia, where we find the highest gender gap, gender disparities, but the factors in play are very different. Here it's more related to resource scarcity, resource shortage, versus here it's more cultural, which is in terms of the patriarchal societies and all of that. This shows the life expectancy. So as doctors, there are a lot of medical people, they can give better explanation, but mostly women are supposed to have a higher life expectancy rate than men, except two countries. When I graphed them, I found two countries, Mali and Swaziland, which showed women had a lower life expectancy than men. All right, so here are my main findings. Am I really done? Should I just... Okay, after I mapped the gender spatial patterns and gender gap indices, next what I did was I looked at the climate vulnerability index. Climate vulnerability index is an index which has been developed by the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. It's freely available on the web. They have two indices which you can use. One is the vulnerability index, which is the top map, shows how vulnerable are each of these countries to climate change. And the bottom one shows the readiness, how ready are these countries. So readiness is in terms of adaptation, how resilient is their infrastructure. If there is sea level rise, if there is a big hurricane, how resilient how ready are they for climate change. They also have another index which is called the exposure index. So they have vulnerability index, exposure index, and readiness index. I've just shown two maps here, and again, to the areas which stand out, if you notice. So if you remember, we talked about how central part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, this is the region where you have high gender gap, and this is the region again which shows out as high vulnerability. These are the areas which are also very highly vulnerable to climate change. And then here the lighter colors means lower readiness score. That is, these countries are less ready in terms of adapting to climate change. So these are my conclusions. What I would like to say is that so my first part of my study was to identify the spatial patterns of climate change, and then look at spatial patterns of gender gap and relate the two. And more or less, I could find visually, if I do just a visual interpretation, I could see that countries which are which have higher gender gaps are also countries which are more vulnerable to climate change, or are not prepared for climate change, or not as adaptable to climate change as countries which have lower gender gap indices. So this is just a comparison between on the left side is my climate vulnerability index, CVI maps, the vulnerability index and the readiness index, and on the right side is a gender development index and gender inequality index. And you can see the clear correlation, especially in Africa. You can see this is the region where you have higher, the colors don't show up as clearly on the PowerPoint, but here on my computer it shows up better. That is, the higher gaps are located in central part of Africa, and that's where you have higher climate change vulnerability. So my first step was to just relate the two. The next part of my study would be to look at, so we can see this, you can read the main findings of my study. But my next step is to look at some of the other aspects. Now that we know that climate change and gender gap climate change is not gender neutral, but to look at some of these major themes like health. There are many studies, and I saw quite a few presentations today also, that health is not gender neutral. But when we talk about health, for instance, malaria or dengue fever, are women more affected will they be more affected by climate change? Pollution, there are studies which show that like pregnancy, when pregnant women can be affected, birth defects can occur due to air pollution. Conflicts and violence is becoming a major topic of study. Especially I would like to look at, for instance, Boko Haram in northern Africa, especially Africa. I would think conflicts and violence would be a bigger issue in terms of climate change. Water. For instance, in this global south, women are responsible for collecting water. So if you're talking about harsher climate conditions, higher temperatures, they have to walk longer distances to get water, so they are being exposed to harsher climate conditions. Not only that, they will also be subjected to more harassment as they are walking to longer distances. And I'm from India, I'm originally from India, and if you read the newspaper any day in India, you would read at least 5 articles about all kinds of harassment. Education, if they have to decide between the education of their son or the daughter, and they don't have the money, it's the girl whose education suffers. We also saw it in Pakistan, in case of Malala. Trying to education of girls. We've seen that in Afghanistan. It's in different forms, education. Food security, this is a more issue, especially in rural areas. In the developing world, especially due to overpopulation, when there's droughts, it's mostly the men who are leaving the rural villages to go to the cities to find work. It's the women who are left behind to take care of the children. And poor nutrition. So there are studies showing that poor nutrition levels associated with food security. Migration, it can be in different forms. It can be gender specific. Sometimes it's men who leave first and then women leave later, but also what they're exposed to, they are more vulnerable. And then changing urban social landscapes, that is due to climate change. Especially we are seeing this in many Asian cities where a lot of migration taking place from rural areas to urban areas. So it's changing the whole urban social landscape. It is becoming different. And we can talk about that more in detail, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the extensive talk. I'm afraid that due to the time, we'll just open the general discussion, and then I want to finish by 10 to 6, so that some of you can go to the VIP meeting. Okay. So we have 3 discussants. We invited them, and we also have others. So maybe just one by one. I was going to ask Londa to lead the discussion, but there's no time. So can you bring the microphone so that they can give any comments on any studies that you'd like? No. Yes. Thank you. Dr. Simone B.
Thank you.
Yes.
Can I ask the last speaker, Shouraseni, a question?
Sure.
You've disappeared into the. Oh, there you are, right
Yeah,
behind
there
me.
you are,
Wonderful. If you would put gender and poverty into one model, can you talk about how much they're interrelated? If you would totally correct for poverty,
Yeah,
would there be an effect for gender left?
Actually, there are greater percentage of women who are below the poverty level, and
Maybe you should take the microphone. I don't know if people can
like
hear.
there is in the gender facts slide.
Sorry. What do you want to do?
So as you can see that 1% of properties worldwide owned by women, 33% of women worldwide are homeless. So basically, the point is that there are greater proportion of women living in poverty, under poor conditions. So that's why they are more vulnerable to climate change. So it again reinforces what my hypothesis is, that climate change is not gender neutral. And in the global south, there are greater proportion of women living, so they are positively correlated. Does that answer?
Yeah, but if you would take a group of men that are comparable in income level to the women, would there still be an added effect of climate change for women? If you'd compare poor women to poor men, which effects would there be for women specifically? You did allude to some of them, but
you know, it would be poor women would be poorer women would be more affected by climate change, mainly because of cultural norms. So if you think about it, in a family, typical family, the mother will eat the last. First, you know, the man will come, he was eating, and then, you know, the kids get the food, and then last is the mother. And that's why malnutrition among women is very common, especially in the developing countries.
yeah, it's a combination of gender and poverty, or poverty and gender. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, Dr. Rice.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to go back to the first presentation from Professor Schiebinger. You are positioning yourself in a very in a robust debate about the use of third-person singular pronouns. So you will find, for example, that people who say things like, for every student who comes to her office, she suggests they study more. That kind of sentence can provoke extensive irritation in the general public by using a allegedly plural pronoun for a singular. You jump into it from a different angle. And I understand that this is annoying when Google Translate makes this assumption. I totally get that. However, you, if I understand you correctly, are suggesting that this feeds future bias. You said on one of your slides it amplifies gender equality in the future. And I think that is an interesting hypothesis, but I don't know if there's a reasonable foundation for actually expecting that those kinds of pronoun mistakes from Google Translate, in fact, I mean, it definitely affects bias in the corpus, but are you familiar with research suggesting that that might affect or create bias in human perception of social realities? And that last step seems to be, if I understand you correctly, a suggestion that you're making, and I'm wondering on what basis you make that.
Very good, because I criticize the nature study for their framing hypotheses. What it would do, I think the only thing that we can really say is it would increase the proportion of he said to she said on the internet, and would force these defaults to a greater extent.
In humans or in machine translation?
In the machine translation.
Right.
And so it's going to impact what you see on the web. And it seems to me then that people will be, I'm sorry, I'm very tired and it seems warm in here. It seems to me that people would be more influenced then by what, because they're building the corpus.
So I understand that intuition, and I share that intuition, and it's just that my experience as a researcher makes me aware that our intuitions aren't always reliable in these kinds of contexts. So I think that there's a fabulous linguistics department at Stanford University, and I bet there's somebody there who would like to either tell us about relevant literature or else get started on some research on this topic.
Yeah, so this whole idea of the machine learning, I generalized it to the Google Translate, but there's pretty strong evidence in these other things. So, but this is a little bit out, I don't know if anybody's a computer scientist, it's a little bit outside of my experience, and I'm not quite there in understanding it yet. But there's a lot, I read a really interesting article about Facebook and how it builds the categories, and how this builds categories of how people start to understand themselves and how they present themselves. So that there is this kind of feedback loop between how you can present yourself, because you have to fill in certain boxes, versus how you might present yourself. And so it is kind of building a culture. So I will certainly go and ask my linguists,
Okay.
especially
Yes.
to satisfy the linguist in the room.
All right.
And
Yeah.
it's a very good question.
Thank you. Dr. Mogil, do you have any other comments to make? Yes. 드려. 아니, 먼저 드리고.
I always have another comment to make. Yeah, so I've been looking for, through this entire session, the whole day, trying to find if there are any overarching themes that I can think of. And I think there's one, and I mentioned it before, but I'll put it out there again. It seems to me that what we're all doing here reduces to looking for interactions where we used to look for main effects. And I actually think that that's a good thing to do, and it seems obvious now, but you don't have to go back very far, where I think there was an active bias against the idea. I remember as a grad student, one of the first experiments I did the experiment, I analyzed the data, and I went up very excited to my advisor, and I said, "Look, John, a significant three-way interaction." And I was very excited about that. And he said to me, he wasn't happy at all. He said, "How are we going to write a paper on a three-way interaction? How are we going to publish that?" He said, "Go back down in the lab and find me a nice significant main effect." But I actually, the longer I've been in science, the longer I've been in academia, the more I think that no, the world is about significant interactions. Main effects, looking for main effects, are what has sort of blindsided us all this time. And so I think that this is great, that people, in very different fields are trying to see if what they study actually interacts with this thing that we probably should be doing out of fairness, but we should be doing anyway just because that the truth lies in the interaction. I guess all I'll throw out there is that if one wanted to play devil's advocate to that position, one would, say, well, where does it end, right? If you start looking for interactions and you're not done until you find all the interactions, then there's a whole lot of other things that one would then be duty-bound to start looking for interactions with, and at that point, the whole thing breaks down. And so, I don't know, I'm just interested if anyone has any comments on,
Yes.
On that. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting the way you're talking about this, and you're obviously talking from a researcher's perspective who wants to get his data published and make sure that it's valid and that you've actually looked at it properly. And I'm a methodologist by training, so I totally understand what you're saying. And I would like to look at interactions from a slightly different perspective, namely how do we implement the outcomes? And that's actually why I asked the question about interaction between poverty and gender. Because I think it's extremely important for someone with a public health background, such as myself, that we know it's not just gender and it's not just poverty, but it's actually a combination of the two. So I think we can satisfy both our science, research, intellectual publishing needs, and also think about how do we actually use these data to change the world. So I totally agree with you that these interactions are extremely important, and we shouldn't look at, and I know that's not what Professor Schiebing is doing, we shouldn't look at gendered innovations as a very simple tool to just divide the world into two binary categories and then we do perfect research. But I think you can look at it both from, do I have valid outcomes, and three-way interactions I think can be extremely interesting. And also, how do we apply the outcomes and how do we implement them? I hope you agree with me.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I think there was a very interesting discussion that's very helpful to everyone who has been working on gendered innovations case. Our last question in the session will be the one.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you so much for this enriching discussion. I want to comment about the machine. And I think that, I don't know whether, Professor, this will be a step in the right direction, but I think before we address the issue of how the machine is going to recognize the male and the female, don't we have to look back at the people doing the programming? Maybe they need to be taught or facilitated differently. I talk about this from an experience that I encountered facilitating engendering teaching of ICT in Makerere University. When we first introduced the session, everybody, the students and their teachers, said computer science and information technology has nothing to do with gender. Why? We deal with machines, we deal with codes. So if that is the perspective they have, then it is very certain they are not going to welcome the fact that the machine product is not gender sensitive. So maybe there's something we need to do to solve this dilemma by looking back at how the teaching is done. Then the other issue I want to raise is the issue about significance. When you talk about the relationship, many times what is significant, important to the women is not going to come out significant in the quantitative results. So then what are we going to do? If the number of women that are affected by climate change because of the way they relate with the environment and their poverty levels is not going to come out significant in the variations, I don't know, the measures they use, the quantitative analysis, then are we going to leave the women languishing in the effects of climate change, or are we going to pick on the little levels of less significance and have measures and strategies in place to benefit the women? Thank you.
Comment.
No, it's a comment.
Just a comment.
Yeah, it's a
comments.
comment.
Yes, yes. So maybe Londa, would you like to make a last sentence before we finish?
Well, I
Final
just thank
words.
everyone for their great research, and I have been very interested in the whole Korean setting today, the whole Asian setting, the Asian Pacific setting, and I think it's really interesting to look at these cultural differences and to be very careful when we talk about gender to keep those cultural differences in play. I think this last talk with, you know, the vast world, you know, it's just really, we want to do very careful research, and we have to keep it situated always in the very political reality of where we live. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. That will be the end of this session. Thank you for all your attention.